I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to Outside Source. We're going to start with new statistics from the World Health Organization. It's recorded the biggest 24-hour increase in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. Most of these new cases are in Latin America and the US. We'll report from Washington and Sao Paulo. The victims of Saturday night's attack in Reading have been named. They were three friends sitting out on a summer's evening. We'll hear about the lives so tragically lost. Coronavirus advice is going to shift for over 2 million people in England who are currently shielding because of health vulnerabilities. The new guidance will be eased in 2 weeks' time. We'll look into that.
Discouraged but full of hope, they sail for Britain. Citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother
72nd
country.
anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush generation. More people are urged to claim the compensation they're owed. And we'll look at why slaughterhouses have been the centre of a number of COVID outbreaks. Well, lest any of us thought this pandemic was entering its final stages, the World Health Organization says it's now recorded the highest rise in coronavirus cases since this pandemic began. On Sunday, 183,000 people around the world were confirmed to have COVID-19. The global total of confirmed cases, well, that's now past 9 million. Interestingly, though, this is what the WHO has said on whether these rising infection numbers mean that some countries shouldn't now ease their lockdowns.
Some countries that have successfully suppressed transmission are now seeing an upswing in cases as they reopen their societies and economies. All countries are facing a delicate balance between protecting their people while minimizing the social and economic damage. It's not a choice between lives and livelihoods. Countries can do both.
Well, the country with the most infections is the United States. 120,000 people have lost their lives. The number of infections there went up by more than 36,000 just on Sunday. The total is over 2.2 million. As you may know, the infection rate in New York was very high. It was the centre of the US outbreak, but that rate is now falling and the city's starting to reopen. Unfortunately, the news is not so good in the south and west of the US. Florida and Arizona, for example, recorded their highest increase in infections over the weekend. And these states, as you can see in these graphs, now seem to be on a similar trajectory to the ones we saw in the northeast of the US through April and May. The most important headline figure, arguably, is that while infections fell in the US in May, they are now rising again in June. Well, to find out more about these rising numbers of infections in some US states, here's Anthony Zerka in Washington.
It seems to be surging in states that have been easing off their shelter-in-place restrictions and allowing businesses to reopen. So places like Texas and Florida and California and Arizona. I mean, it is interesting that these are a lot of southern states, but then again, those were states that weren't hit the hardest early on. New York obviously has seen their cases decline, but that's because they had a high number of cases initially. So I think what you're seeing is people are beginning to stop wearing masks, beginning to start socializing again, beginning to go out to businesses again, and as a result, the virus cases are starting to go back up again.
And can we map how the different states have eased their lockdowns next to their politics? Is there a correlation there?
Well, you know, like I mentioned, California is one of the cases, one of the states that has seen a rise in cases. California is a entirely Democratic-controlled state. Meanwhile, Arizona, Texas, Florida, they're controlled by Republicans. So, you know, it's much more of a relationship between the decisions to ease off on these business closure and shelter-in-place orders rather than the politics of the individual states in question. You know, if you look at Arizona, which is showing one of the largest spikes, they did not have any mask restrictions. They didn't. They began opening very early on. The governor of Arizona just announced last week that he was going to let local officials start to make decisions about whether to require masks in public and whether businesses should be able to continue to have more and more people come in. But when you have local governments doing that, then you could have a kind of a patchwork of response throughout the state. and that is going to be unlikely to be able to arrest the growth of the virus at this point. Gottlieb, who is a former FDA head, he came out and said, looking at Arizona in particular, said that we could reach the point here in that state soon where these kind of gentle mitigation efforts like mask wearing aren't going to be enough. You're seeing hospitalizations go up, you're beginning to see people put on ventilators, the numbers going up, and then it's only a matter of time when death rates start to go up.
Now, let's switch from the US to Brazil, because there more than 50,000 people have died from COVID-19 and the number of new cases continues to rise. Brazil recorded more than 54,000 new infections on Sunday and its total is past 1 million. And given its low testing rate, that figure could be considerably higher. Even so, President Bolsonaro remains committed to the reopening of his economy. Our correspondent Katie Watson has more on this from Sao Paulo.
It was just a little cold, said Brazil's president, when the crisis started. And even as the infections soared and the death toll climbed, Jair Bolsonaro carried on. "I'm no gravedigger," he quipped in April as he was questioned over the numbers. A week later, he was taken to task again. "So what?" he answered. "I'm no miracle worker." As the situation worsens, the president continues to focus on reopening the economy and says little to ease the pain of those who've lost loved ones.
Brazil's hit 2 more grim milestones in a matter of days. More than 1 million cases and more than 50,000 people dead. But not even these numbers are prompting the president to change course. In the middle of a pandemic, many Brazilians feel they're lacking leadership, and the numbers keep going up and up.
Now, next I want to look elsewhere in Latin America. In Peru, new infections continue to increase, more than 3,500 on Sunday. The overall total is past 250,000, and Peru has the highest rate of infection after Brazil. If you factor in Chile and Ecuador as well, all four, 20 to 25 people out of every 100,000 of the population have died because of COVID-19. Mexico's just behind that with an average of 15 to 20 out of every 100,000. The infection rate there is rising too, even though just under half of all the states there are still in what's called the red zone, under the highest alert. That means bars and cinemas are closed, sporting events are cancelled and so on. Well, here's one of the BBC's Latin America correspondents, Will Grant, on why the number of infections in Mexico continues to go up.
Somebody I was speaking to, a Mexican analyst this weekend, said to me, in a sense, normal life is carrying on. I think what quite a few of those countries you've mentioned in your list there have in common is their high levels of poverty, their very rural populations and their very sparse populations too, and obviously great poverty in their urban centres as well. And for a lot of those people, not working, staying at home, locking down with your family simply can mean not eating. So we're seeing, for example, the rates in Peru that we saw, the problems in Mexico that you say are sort of right hot on the heels behind of Brazil, are partly, I believe, coming from the fact that people are still going out to work in various forms. A friend of mine in Tijuana, for example, on the border with the US, said really lockdown here hasn't been respected at all. So I do think that is a big part of the problem.
Let me also ask you about Cuba, Will, because there's a country having a lot more success in controlling the virus. I guess it has a geographical head start on many countries.
It does. That's part of it. It acted very early, but also, it has a lot of experience in dealing with infectious diseases. It's very proud of its record on things like Zika and its medical system in general. And of course, on some of those things like ordering lockdown, because of the fact it's obviously a police state and run by an autocratic government, if they say don't step outside, or when you step outside you must wear a face mask, people are doing it because obviously there are serious consequences to not doing so. So it's obviously being followed through on a lot more harshly, but it is absolutely having a much better effect. They had 3 infections in the past 24 hours and just 2 deaths out of the past 18 days. So Cuba is absolutely on top of the problem.
And we'll come back to other areas of the pandemic a little later in this edition of Outside Source. Now, here in the UK, all 3 victims of Saturday's stabbings in Reading have now been named, as well as James Furlong, who is a teacher in Wokingham, who's been described as inspirational. His friend Joe Ritchie Bennett also died. He was a 39-year-old American who'd lived in the UK for 15 years. His family in Philadelphia say they're heartbroken. And finally, another friend who'd been enjoying the summer evening in the park, David Wales. With more on all three, here's our correspondent, Regini Vaidyanathan.
Back at school for the most painful of reasons. Through the morning, they left tributes to a teacher who always told his pupils to fly high. 36-year-old James Furlong was the head of history and politics at Holt School. With news of his death still sinking in, students and colleagues held a 2-minute silence.
As a Holt community, we all now need to absorb this sad news. Our thoughts are with his mum, his dad, his brother and his family, and his friends and colleagues. He was a cherished colleague and he will be very sadly missed. Thank you.
He wasn't just every average teacher, he was an incredible person. And he wasn't just a teacher, he was a human being, and he had family and friends that loved him just as much as we do.
14-year-old Lucy last saw Mr. Furlong at a history lesson before lockdown.
Well, first he told us everything was going to be fine, you know, Corona's going to end and we're going to see him again. But you know, we're not really, are we? We're not going to see him again.
Former pupils also came to pay their respects to someone they describe as an unforgettable teacher.
I came back today because I feel like I had a really personal connection with Mr. Furlong. He was one of the teachers who was always there for me. The person who tried to put a smile on everyone's faces. He used to come in and dress up as Henry VIII. He had really funny catchphrases. He always made us laugh.
James Furlong was in this park in Reading on Saturday when he was stabbed to death. Today it was confirmed his friend Joe Ritchie Bennett was killed alongside him. An American who lived in the UK for 15 years. He lost his husband to cancer several years ago. BBC Radio Berkshire presenter Sarah Walker was a close friend. She delivered this on-air tribute.
And it matters to me today that you know that Joe lived a great life. He was loved by so many people, and he made us all feel that life was a much better place with him in it.
Tonight, the third victim of the attack has also been named, 49-year-old David Wales.
He was always happy. Everyone had their problems, but he always left that at the door when he walked into the pub. It always made people smile.
3 friends who'd just gone for a catch-up in the sunshine. 3 lives taken for no reason.
While police are continuing to question a 25-year-old Libyan man following Saturday's attack, Kariri Sadala was initially arrested on suspicion of murder after the incident on Saturday and later rearrested under the Terrorism Act. From Reading, our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has this report.
This is thought to be the moment, just minutes after the attack on Saturday night, that unarmed police officers detained the man suspected of killing the 3 friends. But the careful process of gathering and examining evidence for the investigation being run by counter-terrorism policing is still at an early stage. Nobody has yet been charged. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was in Reading this morning to lay flowers, to meet the officers, some of them student officers, that she said ran towards danger, and to discuss what is known about the man in custody.
We have to look at all aspects of this individual's history, which dates back over several years. I think we should be clear about, the origins, the information. That's part of the intelligence gathering and obviously the picture that has to be put together.
The suspect, Khairi Sadala, is 25 years old and Libyan. He came to the UK in 2012 and claimed asylum. He He was allowed to stay here permanently when he was given leave to remain in 2018. He came to the attention of MI5 last year as someone who might take part in terrorism overseas, but they assessed that he was not a genuine threat or an immediate risk. Neighbours said he threw a TV from his top-floor flat this year and had a mental health key worker. Khairi Sadalah's family told us that he originally left Libya to escape the violence there and because he was suffering from post-traumatic stress from the civil war, though he had been thinking of trying to return. They said that his long-standing mental health problems had been exacerbated by the coronavirus lockdown. An eyewitness has told the BBC that the knife man walked through the park before attacking the group of gay men sitting on the grass. While Reading town centre remains dominated by police tape and forensics teams, faith leaders came together to pay tribute to the dead friends.
Our prayers are very much with the people who have died as a result of this terrible stabbing. Our prayers too with the survivors.
He said they would say prayers too for the attacker, that he would see the evil of his ways.
Well, in a few minutes on Outside Source, we're going to talk about that wildlife researchers want detailed study of how the animal world's been reacting to lockdown. Victoria Gill is going to take us through this, and in particular, what an anthropause is. Now, if you're one of the over 2 million people in England who's been shielding because of a pre-existing health condition, restrictions are easing in a fortnight and ending at the start of August. You'll be able to meet up to 6 people outdoors and form support bubbles with other households. In Scotland, the restrictions will continue until at least the same time, the start of August. That's when Northern Ireland's restrictions are due to end. The Welsh Government says restrictions will continue until mid-August. This means many clinically vulnerable people could be heading back to work, and there's concern about whether that's safe. Here's the UK's Health Secretary.
It's so important that employers work with us and, crucially, work with their employees to support them to get back to work in a COVID-secure environment. And it's critical that work is provided in a COVID-secure way for people who are shielding.
I'm Ros Atkins with Outside Source. We're here as usual in the BBC newsroom. Our lead story is that there's been a record number of new coronavirus cases in one day. 183,000 people around the world have been confirmed positive. The third person killed in the Reading stabbings has been named. David Wales died alongside Joe Ritchie Bennett and his friend James Furlong on Saturday. Well, let's look through some of the other main stories from BBC World Service. BBC Arabic is covering Saudi Arabia's announcement that it will be holding what it calls a very limited Hajj this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. Only pilgrims already in Saudi Arabia will be allowed to take part. The Afghan government says last week was the deadliest for its security forces in the last 19 years. It's accusing the Taliban of killing nearly 300 members of its security forces during more than 400 attacks. The Taliban dismisses this as propaganda to disrupt the peace process. That's from the BBC's Afghan service. Tens of thousands of South African commuters have been left stranded by a strike by minibus drivers. Major roads in Johannesburg and Pretoria were blocked. The drivers are demanding more financial support from the government, saying the coronavirus and the restrictions it's brought have reduced their income. That's from BBC Africa. Now let's switch to France because the coronavirus lockdown has been eased further there. Millions of students up to the age of 15 went back to school today as attendance became compulsory. Swimming pools and cinemas are also reopening. We also learned today that Disneyland Paris is going to open in phases starting on July the 15th. Now, France is by no means back to normal. Here are some of the remaining restrictions. People are supposed to maintain 1 metre distance from each other in public. Masks are required on all public transport, and gatherings of 5,000 or more will not be allowed until at least the end of August. Many of the people in these crowds in Paris, that you may see in a minute on Sunday night, weren't following the social distancing rule. They were celebrating There they are, celebrating the annual Fête de la Musique music festival. Police intervened to disperse people and enforce social distancing as best they could. There were 6 arrests for throwing projectiles and 1 for violence committed against police. Well, from France to Spain, it's lifted its state of emergency over the weekend. Among other things, this means it's reopened its borders to visitors from most of Europe. It's allowing British tourists in without having to quarantine now. Damien Grammaticus took one of the first flights out to Spain and is on the beach in Alicante.
Spain has ended its emergency, opened up to new arrivals, scrapped its quarantine, and yes, it looks enticing, doesn't it? The beaches are open, the cafes and bars are open, but there are big differences to remember. So, on the beach, distancing is being enforced. I don't know if you can make out, but there are posts on the beach with colours on the top. Those are meant to mark how you're meant to stay apart from each other. You're meant to leave a gap down by the sea where people can get in and out of the water. If you go into town, most hotels are still closed because they are waiting for more arrivals to come. And the journey here is very different too. So I was on that flight today from East Midlands Airport. It was one of the first. Only about 20% of seats on that plane had been sold. As soon as you got to the terminal, you were temperature checked just to get in. You had to wear a mask from that point on, onto the plane and through the entire journey. You can't take your mask off. You're only allowed out of your seat on the plane if you want to go to the toilet, if you buzz for the cabin crew who come and tell you if it's free and there's no queue there. Otherwise, you just have to stay seated through the entire flight. And when you land, then again you're temperature checked on arrival in Spain. You have to fill out contact details in case anyone on the plane turns out to be carrying the virus. And you then have to give all of your travel plans as well. So once you get here, it'll be a very different experience. But remember, at the minute, the UK still has quarantine. So going back, you'll still have to do 2 weeks quarantine in the UK.
So there's Damien on how it's been a different experience for people in Spain. Of course, it's also been a different experience for animals. There have been lots of stories about how animals have been behaving differently during the lockdown in particular. With us out of the way, some of them have been making the most of it. Well, researchers have a name for this, an anthropause, and they're urging further study of what exactly has been happening with animals during this extraordinary period. I've been talking to our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
Unprecedented, I think, is probably the most overused word in the reporting of the pandemic, but this is an unprecedented lack of human activity. So, through huge human and economic costs, through the most tragic of circumstances, we've sort of pushed the pause button on human movement and activity through lockdown all over the world. So what these scientists are saying, and they're wildlife scientists who are basically involved in tracking animal movement and looking at how we share the planet with lots of other species in every continent all over the world. What they're saying is that we need to bring together that data where all these different species have been tracked so that we can really measure exactly what's gone on before, during and after lockdown. We can measure the impact of our own absence because, as you can imagine, on an increasingly crowded planet, it is very difficult to measure human absence, and here's a unique opportunity.
What kind of things do you think they're expecting to find?
Well, it's all about what they're keen to understand is how we might take lessons from lockdown and make some easy and attainable changes that might have a good impact for wildlife and nature. So we know, and scientists fully expect, that, say, the road network being so very quiet is going to be very good for a lot of species, especially migrating species, terrestrial land animals that can move around much more easily. There's going to be a lot less roadkill. They're even suggesting, some scientists are suggesting that might have population scale impacts for species like hedgehogs in the UK, for example, where they reckon about a third of those animals per year, the third of the mortality of those animals per year is on the roads. So we know that it's potentially going to have some beneficial impacts. What they're looking at is where the biggest impacts are. So if you find certain spaces while you're tracking animals or where that movement increases and where you get some beneficial effects, then maybe that's where you could put in a wildlife corridor or a crossing, or maybe that's where you could reshape the transport network a little bit so that we could take some of those beneficial impacts out of lockdown and into the future so we can sort of share our space a lot more successfully.
And I've only a few seconds, Victoria, but presumably there's a flip side to this, a detriment, which is as lockdown eases, all these animals who had got used to one thing have to get used to it changing again.
Yeah, we would expect that the transport in particular and all that the roads would get busier. So that's the real aim, is to take some long-term lessons from this.
Interesting sports story here. Novak Djokovic is being criticised for staging a travelling tennis tournament in Croatia and Serbia after 2 players and 2 support staff tested positive for COVID-19. Part of the tournament looked like the pandemic had never happened. Handshakes, hugs, no social distancing. Not that they're technically doing anything wrong. Croatia had eased its lockdown and social distancing wasn't required. But now Borna Cilic and Grigor Dimitrov are the 2 players who have the virus. They played each other on Saturday. The final, in which Djokovic was supposed to play, has perhaps unsurprisingly been cancelled. The tournament said, at all times we have strictly followed the epidemiological measures in place with the countries where the Adria Tour was organised. Of course, there's a certain irony here. The tournament was set up by Djokovic to help players get back to match fitness after several weeks without competition. Clearly the idea wasn't for the players to get the virus. Well, thank you very much for watching this section of Outside Source. I'll be back with you in a couple of minutes' time.
Or love it or loathe it, but we are in for the hottest spell of weather since last summer. And by the middle of the week, widely across England, temperatures will be approaching or even exceeding 30 degrees Celsius. And with that will come also very high UV levels, so some strong sunshine out there. And here's the Europe-wide heat wave, the current of hot air coming out of Spain and France spreading across the UK. But the thinking is that by the time we get to the weekend, low pressure from the Atlantic is actually going to bring fresher conditions. So this low is going to win and push away the heat further towards the east. And with that, also we'll get some showers and thunderstorms, but that's not until the weekend. This is what's happening in the short term. Here, in fact, is a weather front. It's a boundary between the fresher Atlantic air and that hotter continental air. And where we've got that boundary, we have a lot of cloud and outbreaks of rain, but it's also quite humid here because the air stream's coming all the way from the south. So 14, 15 in Glasgow overnight, whereas under the clearer skies in England, temperatures will be around 11 degrees first thing in the morning. But that weather front will continue to be stuck between the hot high across the continent and the low pressure out in the Atlantic. So rather than this weather front moving across the UK, it'll be sliding along itself. So that means that pulses of rain will move through Ireland into Belfast and Glasgow and right across the Western Isles. But eastern Scotland and much of the country, certainly England and Wales, in for a bright, if not sunny day, and a hot one further south, up to 28 on Tuesday. Now here's Wednesday's weather map. In fact, the hot air is expected to spread northwards, in fact reaching northern England too. Temperatures in Newcastle of around 26 degrees and widely 30 or more across central and southern England. And on Thursday, those temperatures will rise a little further, probably peaking at around 32 in London, and in the lowlands of Scotland, around 26 degrees Celsius. And then towards the end of the week, we'll start to see low pressure approaching. Clouds will start to gather in the north of the country. And then by the time we get to the weekend, those temperatures will be quite a bit low. But we could peak at 33 on Friday in the southeast.
How dare you, Greta Thunberg told world leaders in the UN. So how does it feel like to become a global figure? How does climate action connect with Black Lives Matter? Is coronavirus an opportunity, and why does she still have hope?
The Greta Thunberg interview, Saturday at 5:30 on the BBC News Channel. From the first note.
He is a tiny, friendless, grubby kid.
You have an addicted father. That makes every childhood tough.
To the final flourish.
The idea that he was losing his hearing would have been devastating.
That sense of touch becomes the music.
A life story.
He changes the course of music.
Celebrating his 250th anniversary. Being Beethoven, part of Beethoven Unleashed season. Coming soon to BBC4 and iPlayer.
طيب عم بتصل بيك مشان الشغاله المحطوط على الانترنت عندك.
When I come in quick, I look like an orphan, like a slave.
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC, offering personal insights into global events.
Sería muy prudente que no firmáramos más.
Our World, stories that speak for themselves.
Say Play BBC News to your smart speaker at any time to get the latest headlines and in-depth reports. Just say Play BBC News.
I'm Ross Atkins, welcome back to Outside Source. Our lead story is that the WHO has recorded the biggest 24-hour increase in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. The number of confirmed cases around the world has now passed 9 million, with most new infections in Latin America and the US. The victims of Saturday night's attack in Reading have been named. They were 3 friends sitting out on a summer's evening.
Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain. Citizens of the British Empire.
On the 72nd anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush generation, more people are being urged to claim the compensation that they're owed. And we'll look in detail at why slaughterhouses have been the centre of a number of COVID outbreaks. Now, let's pick up on that story. There's been a lot of attention recently on slaughterhouses and how some have become the centre of COVID outbreaks. For example, this meat processing plant in Germany, more than 1,300 positive tests have been linked to the factory, and 7,000 employees and their families are now in quarantine. In fact, that outbreak's so large that on its own it's helped to push up Germany's R number. That's the measure of how fast the virus is spreading. Scientists want to see that R number under 1. In Germany, it's risen to 2.8. Now, this plant's in northwest Germany. Its management says the outbreak may have begun when workers travelled to Eastern Europe at the end of Germany's lockdown. Maybe, but focus has shifted to the working conditions at the plant. The owner is a German billionaire, and he held a press conference over the weekend.
As a businessman and someone who puts people first, I can only offer my complete apologies because we are the cause of this issue and carry full responsibility, me as a businessman and the company as a whole.
Now, more broadly, Germany's been praised for its handling of this pandemic. In the last few weeks, though, people have been adjusting to the easing of lockdown rules, and some are calling this moment, this particular outbreak, a psychological blow. The Guardian article you can see here describes a level of fury in the affected region. And there are, of course, fears in Germany, as we've seen elsewhere, of a second wave of infections. Here's Damien McGuinness in Berlin.
For these individuals involved in these outbreaks, it's incredibly serious. However, we've got a few caveats with this quite drastically rising R number. One of them is that because the infection rates in Germany overall are pretty low, any small jump in the numbers does lead to a quite rapid rise in that R factor. The other thing is that what we're seeing with these localised outbreaks is that so far the authorities have acted pretty effectively, and there's no sign that they've spread to the wider community. So throughout Germany as a whole, infection rates are pretty low, and 140 local authorities, for example, say they've not seen any new infections for the past 7 days. So what we're seeing so far in Germany, despite these quite concerning individual localised outbreaks, there's no sign of a second wave nationwide as yet, but certainly the individual incidents are extremely worrying.
Now, this focus on meat processing plants is not isolated to Germany at all. Outbreaks have forced plants to shut in other parts of Europe, in the Americas, in Australia. Here in the UK, for example, 3 sites were closed last week after clusters of infection were discovered. 150 people tested positive at a bacon plant in Cleckheaton. There have been further outbreaks at a food plant in Wrexham and elsewhere in Wales at the Two Sisters plant in Anglesey, which is the UK's biggest chicken plant. All 560 workers are now self-isolating. Thomas Morgan's in Cardiff.
There are 7 health boards across Wales, and where this incident took place on that health board, it was actually an area where there had been one of the lowest numbers of coronavirus during the outbreak across Wales. What has happened was, well, this began last week, actually, around last Tuesday, when 1 or 2 of the workers started to come down with coronavirus symptoms. By the end of last week, a number more had come down with symptoms and has tested positive. And then it was decided to shut down the plant. We now know that there are over 150 workers that have been tested positive for coronavirus, and the company have closed down the plant entirely now, and everyone that works there is self-isolating. Now, what the Welsh government have said is that because they want to limit the spread of the virus and make sure that nobody else catches it, other than the people whose families they live with, they are considering locking down the island and making sure that nothing can come in or out to make sure that virus doesn't spread. Now, schools in Wales were due to reopen a week today, but we now understand that that won't be happening because they don't want the virus to spread anymore. Now, of course, this plant is a plant that manufactures and processes chicken for a number of high street and fast food chains across Britain. But the Food Standards Agency has said that there is no risk that the virus can be passed on by the food that comes out of the plant. So there's no danger to anyone else outside of the workforce.
Now, the focus on meat processing plants is not a huge surprise. Conditions inside slaughterhouses make them ideal breeding grounds for COVID-19. There are a number of reasons for that. The US agency, the CDC, has documented some of them. It describes cramped conditions along processing lines, plus long hours in close proximity to workers, and then the layout of the factory floor as all barriers to social distancing. It adds that the pace of work and the physical demands make it difficult to always wear face coverings. Other research has been carried out looking into the issue of noise. Research was conducted by a team in London. It looks at how the presence of loud noise can bring workers physically closer sometimes. Socioeconomic factors are also well documented. We know, for example, that in Europe and in the US, the meat industry relies on cheap migrant labour. Many people travel to work by bus or in shared cars, making it easier for the disease to spread. Communication also presents a challenge. The CDC points out that in one factory in the US, 40 different languages are spoken. We also saw this FT article focusing on Germany. It says working up to 60 hours a week, the migrants live 7 to 8 per accommodation provided by subcontracting agencies. So again, conditions for the disease to spread. And there's one other important factor, the cold environments in these plants. Here's one virologist on that.
So the cold temperature doesn't help because we know that humidity and heat helps destroy the virus. So that means that the virus will be on surfaces for longer, which therefore increases the potential for transmission. But really, when it looks at the epidemiological factors that are most involved in transmission, it's density of people. So it really is the number of people in one place for an extended period of time.
Now, this issue is acute in the US. Nearly 200 meatpacking plants have reported outbreaks. For example, in Indiana, 900 employees at a pork factory caught the virus. More than 800 were infected at another facility in South Dakota. 8 people died in Greeley, Colorado. And here's another statistic. According to the Food and Environment Reporting Network, 20,000 meatpacking workers in the US have fallen ill with COVID-19. All of that applies pressure on food supplies. In April, Donald Trump used presidential powers to force some meat processing factories to stay open. He cited national security reasons. So is the food supply chain a valid concern now? Here's Anthony Zerker in Washington.
It's not only, with these facilities shutting down because of outbreaks with them, but when they're reopening again, the process has to be changed to ensure workers' safety. So the production rate declines, and that causes backlogs in the supply chain all the way to, from the people who are producing the pork, raising the hogs and beef, to the grocery stores in the neighborhood. So when you get disruptions in the supply chain, two things happen. One, you get less of the supply, so there aren't as many pieces of meat on the shelves in stores, and also prices gone up. And you have seen both those things happen in the U.S. over the past couple months. Although I will say recently it seems like the chain has been restored somewhat, so the supply at least has increased, if not the prices going down.
And does the meat processing industry in the US accept that it has a particular issue with reference to COVID?
Oh, I think they do acknowledge that that there is a threat to workers' safety. You see each company handled it a little bit differently, and of course the Trump administration, as you mentioned, in April came in with that order under the Defense Production Act saying that this was critical infrastructure and essentially prevented states and localities from imposing additional requirements on these meat production facilities beyond what was recommended by the federal government. If you talk to meatpacking producers, they say they're doing everything they have to. They're doing everything that's necessary to protect this health and safety of their workers, although there are worker unions and advocacy groups that are saying that there's still not enough, that people are still getting sick, that they're being forced to get back to work or forego a paycheck, and that they are essentially sacrificing their health in order to ensure their financial security.
Thanks, Anthony. You're watching Outside Source.
Discouraged but full of hope, they sail for Britain. Citizens of the British...
On the 72nd anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush generation, more people are being urged to claim the compensation they're owed. Now, next we're going to talk about NASCAR, huge US motor racing institution, and it's launching an investigation after a noose was found in the garage stall of Bubba Wallace, who's NASCAR's only full-time black driver. In this statement posted on Twitter, Wallace described the incident as a despicable act of racism that left him incredibly saddened. And relevant to this is that Wallace successfully campaigned to get the Confederate flag banned from all races. The flag's long been seen as a symbol of slavery and racism. But despite the trackside ban, this happened before Sunday's racing at Talladega. A small plane flew over the track, trailing a Confederate flag and a banner that read, "Defund NASCAR." Well, earlier this month, when the ban came into place, Bubba Wallace spoke to the BBC.
I would see it, and it wouldn't affect me. And I always said, you know, I'm just here chasing checkered flags, and would kind of give that very bland answer. But that was me only thinking for myself, as to where nowadays we are encouraging people to listen to other people and hear their stories and to speak out and step up for what's right in today's world, especially after Mr. George Floyd's life was taken. And now when I see it, I hear stories, and the people that have been to NASCAR races that are from the African-American background, so they've been to one race, but the flag being flown proudly, it bothered them very much, and that they would not return back. So I started thinking, I'm like, if we can have a full new face come into the sport just by removing a flag that a lot of people see as heritage, but a larger group of people see as hate and oppression, and a lot of bad things come from that flag. And it's like, let's get rid of it. No one should feel uncomfortable coming to a NASCAR race. I said that before, and I'll say it again. Everybody should come to have a good time and cheer on their favorite drivers.
This is Outside Source here in the BBC Newsroom. Our lead story is that there's been a record number of new coronavirus cases in the world in one day. 183,000 have been recorded. The third person killed in the Reading stabbings has been named. David Wales died alongside Joe Ritchie Bennett and his friend James Furlong on Saturday. Now, on the 72nd anniversary of the Empire Windrush arriving at Tilbury Docks, the head of a new group addressing the challenges faced by the Windrush generation and their families has urged those affected to claim compensation. The group's been set up after people from the Commonwealth were told wrongly they were illegally in the UK. Some were left destitute, others were deported. But the government's been criticised for being too slow in settling claims. Out of 1,000 applications, only 60 have so far been paid. Our Community Affairs correspondent Rhianna Croxford has more.
Meet Denzel, Sherry-Ann and Danny, brothers and a sister caught in the Windrush scandal, whose lives were left in limbo as they struggled with their immigration status.
It's mad, it's absolute madness that we are still fighting for this in 2020. We're still fighting for certain rights as people that were brought here in 1956, 1930s.
You know, you get you paranoid. You always go look at your shoulders. Every time you see a white van, you always go, you know, like you're a criminal. You always go try to run. You can't go to school. You can't go out with your friends. You can't travel. I lost 12 years of my life.
The whole teenage life.
The whole teenage life. I never had the fun of doing nothing, and I couldn't afford a ID, get ID, nothing. I couldn't even act like a teenager. So yeah, it messed with my mental state.
It took their father Cletus, a successful musician, pictured here in the middle, 62 years to have his citizenship confirmed after he came to Britain from St. Lucia in 1956.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans.
He was one of thousands of Commonwealth citizens from the Windrush generation who, unable to provide original documentation, were wrongly treated as illegal immigrants, risked deportation, and were denied rights to healthcare and benefits. Cletus's family have just filed their claim for compensation, but 2 years on since the scheme launched, critics say there's been little progress. So far, 1,275 claims have been made, but only 60 people have received payment. Between them, they've been given just over £360,000. This is the man now leading a new government group to tackle the challenges still faced by this generation and their families.
We cannot afford for this to fail. Too much blood has been spilt by many for this country. So therefore, they're not granting us a favour. It's an inherent right.
There's now a third generation of Cletus's family who are British citizens, but Sherry-Ann, Denzel and Danny say no amount of money can give them back the years they were robbed. Rhianna Croxford, BBC News.
Well, there have been two dimensions of the coronavirus story we've been focused on today. There's been the highest ever number of new infections in 24 hours recorded around the world. That's from the WHO, and those numbers are being driven by Latin America and the US. In Europe, it's a different story. We've seen France ease its lockdown still further this Monday. We've also seen changes in Spain, and through this week, we're expecting the UK as well to detail how, in different ways, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales will ease their lockdowns too. Thanks for watching.